My name is Marcus Doyle, and 11 minutes is exactly how long it took for a lawsuit my father and brother had spent 14 months building to collapse in a courtroom in Travis County, once a single piece of paper they'd both signed and forgotten about got handed to a judge. I want to start before the lawsuit, though, because the 11 minutes only make sense if you understand the 6 years before them, and because I've learned, watching this story get retold badly by people who weren't there, that the version where I'm simply the wrong genius and they're simply the greedy villains isn't true, even though it's the version that gets the most views. I've thought a lot in the months since about how strange it is that the moment people find most satisfying about this whole ordeal, a single document ending a 14-month legal fight in the space of a coffee break, is also the moment I find hardest to feel good about because it wasn't a triumph of cleverness or strategy. It was an accident of paperwork, filed 6 years earlier by people who had no idea what it would eventually cost them, and there's nothing especially satisfying about winning a family war with a document nobody meant as a weapon. My father, Walter Doyle, built Doyle Precision Bookkeeping from nothing, starting in 1987 out of a spare bedroom in Round Rock with a single client, a hardware store that needed its books untangled after the previous accountant had, essentially, stopped showing up. He used to tell that story at every company holiday party, the same version every year, embellished slightly with each retelling. The hardware store owner who almost didn't hire him because he looked too young, the first invoice he sent that bounced because he'd forgotten to include his own bank routing number, the year he finally hired his first employee. A woman named Ruth who stayed with the firm for over 3 decades and retired only 2 years before it closed. I grew up hearing that story so many times I could recite it myself by the time I was 10, and I think, looking back, that story functioned less as company history and more as my father's entire personal mythology, proof, repeated annually, that he had built something real out of nothing through sheer persistence, a narrative he needed increasingly badly as the firm's fortunes began to turn against him decades later. By the time I was old enough to understand what my father did for a living, Doyle Precision had grown into a genuinely respected regional firm, 40 employees, offices in 3 Texas cities, handling books and tax prep for a client roster of small and mid-sized manufacturers and contractors who'd stayed loyal to my father for decades because he was, whatever else is true in the story, extremely good at his job and relentlessly honest about numbers in a way that built real trust. He worked 6 days a week for most of my childhood, and I remember, more than almost anything else about him from those years, the particular quality of his attention when he was reviewing a client's books. Total, absorbed, the same intensity he almost never brought to a dinner table conversation or a school event, and I think some part of me, without fully realizing it until much later, spent my whole childhood trying to figure out how to earn that same quality of attention from him in some other arena, since numbers seemed to be the only thing that reliably got it. My older brother, Denny, went to work there straight out of college, the expected heir, the son who was always going to run the place someday, and for a long time that plan made sense to everyone, including me. Denny was good at the client relationship side of the business in a way I never was. He remembered birthdays, showed up to clients' kids' graduations, had the specific gregarious warmth that makes people trust you with their finances, and I think, for most of our 20s, he genuinely believed, and I genuinely believed alongside him, that he was building towards something solid and permanent, a business he'd inherit and grow, and eventually hand to his own kids someday. I went a different direction, more by accident than design. I studied computer science at UT Austin, and during my junior year, working a part-time job at Doyle Precision doing basic data entry to help pay rent, I got frustrated enough with the firm's clunky, outdated client reconciliation process, hours of manual cross-referencing between bank statements and ledger entries that any of us could have automated with the right tool, that I built a small script, on my own laptop, on my own time, mostly as a way to make my own job easier. My father saw it working one afternoon, watched it do in 4 minutes what used to take an associate most of a morning, and he was, to his credit, genuinely impressed, told me I had a gift, encouraged me to keep building it out. I did, over the following 2 years, expanding it from a personal script into something closer to an actual application, testing it informally on Doyle Precision's own books with my father's casual blessing, the kind of loose, handshake permission that happens easily inside a family business and turns out, years later, to matter enormously in a courtroom. I graduated, took the tool with me, a tool I had designed, coded, and iterated on almost entirely alone, using my own equipment on evenings and weekends, with Doyle Precision's data serving as informal test cases rather than any kind of commission work product, and spent the next 18 months rebuilding it from the ground up into a genuine SaaS product I called Ledgerly, aimed not at small bookkeeping firms like my father's, but at mid-market finance teams who needed automated reconciliation at a scale Doyle Precision never operated at. Those 18 months were, without exaggeration, the hardest sustained stretch of work I've ever done. I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 other guys from my program, eating instant ramen more often than I'd like to admit, writing code until 3 or 4 in the morning most nights while working a day job doing IT support for a mid-sized law firm downtown, just to cover rent. Nobody in my family funded that stretch. Nobody in my family particularly understood what I was doing during it, either. I remember a Thanksgiving that year where my father asked, not unkindly but genuinely puzzled, whether I'd thought about getting a real job at a real company instead of whatever it was I was building in my apartment, a question that stung more than he probably intended it to, precisely because it echoed something I was already afraid of at 2 in the morning most nights. I raised a modest friends and family seed round in 2017, about $400,000 from a dozen small investors, incorporated properly, filed the appropriate exemption paperwork with the SEC under Regulation D, and spent the next 6 years building Ledgerly into a company that, as of this year, processes reconciliation for over 300 mid-market clients and employs 61 people across 2 offices, with a valuation, per most recent funding round, north of $90 million. My father was one of those original friends and family investors. I want to be honest about that because it matters enormously to everything that came after. He put in $15,000 in early 2017, not as a founder, not as a technical contributor, but as exactly what the paperwork said he was, an early believer writing a modest check into his son's new venture, the same way 3 of my college friends and my Aunt Renata did. I remember the day he wired it, actually, because it was one of the few times in my adult life he'd called me just to talk, not about anything specific, mostly just to say he thought what I was building was smart and that he wanted to be part of it, however small his part turned out to be. I didn't fully appreciate, at 24, how rare that phone call was for us, how much it stood out against the general texture of a relationship built more around shared silence than shared enthusiasm. Denny didn't invest anything himself, but he was, in those early conversations, encouraging in his own way, mostly by not actively discouraging me, which in my family sometimes counted as support. Here's what changed slowly over the following 6 years, and here's the part where I try to actually explain my father and brother instead of just condemning them because I think it matters. Doyle Precision struggled, quietly, and then not so quietly, through the back half of that decade. The bookkeeping and small firm accounting industry got hammered by cheap, capable software, some of it built by companies not unlike mine, though not mine specifically, and by 2021, Doyle Precision had lost nearly a third of its client base to firms that could offer automated reconciliation at a fraction of the labor cost. My father, then 68, watched a business he'd built over 34 years shrink under him in real time, and I think, watching my company grow at the exact same moment his was contracting, something curdled in him that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with an old man's grief over watching his life's work become obsolete while his own son's company thrived, built, in his mind, on a tool that had started life inside his own office. Denny's situation was different, and I think in some ways sadder. He'd spent 20 years building his entire adult identity around being the future of Doyle Precision, and by 2022, at 44, he was watching that future evaporate, laying off people he'd hired himself, having the actual conversation with our father about whether the firm could survive another 5 years. I remember a call with him that same year, one of the last normal conversations we had before things fully soured, where he told me, almost offhand, that he'd started having trouble sleeping, that he'd lie awake running through the client roster in his head trying to figure out which accounts might leave next, a kind of anxiety I recognized because I'd carried a version of it myself during Ledgerly's early years. Except Denny's version came with the added weight of watching something built by his own father, something he'd never chosen so much as inherited the expectation of come apart under him regardless of what he did. I don't think Denny woke up one day and decided to be my enemy. I think he woke up, across a period of maybe 18 months, increasingly convinced of a story that made his own professional collapse make sense, A story where my success wasn't the result of 6 years of my own work, but the result of something taken from the family, from him, specifically, at the exact moment the family business needed it most. It's a much easier story to live inside than the true one, which is that an entire industry shifted and Doyle Precision hadn't adapted fast enough, and nobody, including me, was really to blame for that in any clean way. The lawsuit was filed in early spring, 14 months ago now, by an attorney named Holbrook who specialized, I later learned, in exactly this kind of dispute, family-adjacent IP claims against successful ventures, cases that settle more often than they go to trial because defendants, even confident ones, rarely want the exposure of a public fight with their own father. The complaint alleged that Ledgerly's core reconciliation technology had been developed, using proprietary methods and confidential business information belonging to Doyle Precision Bookkeeping, that I had breached an implied duty of confidentiality as a former employee, and that Doyle Precision was entitled to a substantial ownership stake in Ledgerly, framed not as a percentage, but as a dollar figure. $11 million, presumably calculated off some formula Holbrook's team had built. Connecting my father's original 2017 investment to the company's current valuation, inflated by a theory of foundational contribution that had almost nothing to do with actual securities law and almost everything to do with what a jury might find emotionally persuasive about a father suing his own son. I found out about the lawsuit the way I found out about most bad news that year, through a certified letter, not a phone call, which told me something about where things stood before I'd even opened the envelope. I remember standing in my own kitchen holding it, Theo's drawings still taped to the refrigerator behind me, reading the word plaintiffs, Walter Doyle and Dennis Doyle 3 times before it fully landed, before I let myself feel the specific vertigo of seeing my father's and brother's names formatted as legal adversaries instead of family. I called my mother that night, not my father, because she and my father had been separated for 6 years by then, another piece of family history that I think matters to how all of this happened. She'd left him not out of any dramatic betrayal, but out of an accumulation of 30-plus years of being married to a man who measured his own worth entirely through Doyle Precision success, and who had less and less left over, emotionally, for a marriage once the business became the only thing that seemed to prove he mattered. She told me on the phone that night, something I've held on to since. Your father doesn't know how to be smaller than he was. He's never once in his life known how to do that gracefully, and I think watching you get bigger while he gets smaller broke something in him that has nothing to do with facts. My mother has rebuilt a genuinely full life in the years since the separation. She teaches watercolor classes at a community center in Georgetown now, something she'd wanted to do since before I was born and never had room for during her marriage, and she has, I think, more peace in her current life than she had in the last 15 years of the one before it. She offered, that night on the phone, to talk to my father herself, to try to talk him out of proceeding, and I told her not to, that this wasn't hers to fix, a boundary I think surprised both of us to hear me set so clearly, but one that felt necessary. I didn't want my father's decision to sue me to become, indirectly, one more thing my mother had to manage on his behalf. The way she'd managed so much of his emotional life during their marriage. I hired an attorney, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Priyanka Shah who has handled several IP disputes for tech companies and who told me, in our first meeting, something that reframed the entire case for me. The strongest defense in cases like this usually isn't proving a negative, proving you didn't take something. It's finding the moment the plaintiff themselves affirmatively said, in writing, that they had no claim. People sign things in the middle of an unrelated process all the time, and those documents outlive whatever story they tell themselves later. She asked me to pull every piece of formation paperwork from Ledgerly's 2017 founding, every investor document, every filing, and cross-reference it against anyone now named in the lawsuit. It took her associate, a meticulous young lawyer named Boone, about 3 weeks to find it, buried in the original SEC Form D exemption filing from our 2017 seed round, a filing that, as part of standard compliance for a Regulation D private offering, required every listed investor to sign an accredited investor certification that included a clause affirming they held no ownership, licensing, or intellectual property interest in the issuer's underlying technology or business methods beyond the securities being purchased. My father had signed that certification as an investor. Denny, who'd been listed as an authorized company contact during the raise, helping me organize investor documents that year as an informal favor before things between us soured, had also signed a related compliance acknowledgement, affirming, on Ledgerly's behalf, that the company held clear and exclusive rights to its core technology, with no competing claims from any third party, a document he'd signed 6 years earlier, entirely as a favor to his little brother, never imagining it would end up being the exact document that would destroy the case he'd later helped build against me. I remember sitting in Priyanka's office when Boone laid both documents on the table, feeling something complicated that wasn't quite triumph, closer to a strange, sick vertigo, understanding that the thing that was going to save my company was a piece of paper my own brother had signed to help me, back when he was still, in whatever limited way our family allowed, on my side. Priyanka watched my face and, uncharacteristically for her, paused the meeting for a moment. "You don't have to feel good about this," she said. "You just have to use it. Those are two different things, and you're allowed to hold both." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me during those 14 months. The hearing was in the Travis County Courthouse downtown, a modern building with none of the wood-paneled gravity of older courtrooms, all glass and pale wood and fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly tired. My father and Denny sat at the plaintiff's table in new suits. I noticed that detail specifically because my father had worn the same 3 suits to every important occasion for as long as I could remember, and seeing him in something unfamiliar told me how much this case meant to him, how much he decided to treat it like the most important professional moment of the back half of his life. Denny leaned over and said something to him partway through Holbrook's opening statement that made them both laugh, quietly, and I remember watching that laugh and feeling something in my chest go very cold and very clear because I understood, in that moment, that whatever this case was to them, it wasn't only about money. It was about being right, about restoring some version of order, where the Doyle who stayed loyal to the family business ended up on top instead of the one who left. The defendant's company was built on stolen intellectual property belonging to the family business, Holbrook declared, pacing with a kind of practiced confidence that made me understand why families hired him specifically. He spent nearly 20 minutes laying out the theory of the case, referencing my early years at Doyle Precision, my unfettered access to the firm's internal processes, framing the entire founding of Ledgerly as an extraction rather than a creation, and I sat there, next to Priyanka, watching my own history get rewritten in real time by a man who'd never met me before that morning, constructing a version of my 20s that erased essentially all of the actual work. The judge, a measured man named Castellano, asked for a response. Priyanka stood, walked to the bench without hurry, and handed Judge Castellano a single document. "Your Honor, this is the SEC registration filing from 2017, filed in connection with the defendant's Regulation D private offering. It is signed by both plaintiffs. It certifies, under penalty of federal securities law, that neither plaintiff held any ownership or intellectual property interest in the defendant's underlying technology or business methods." She let that sit for a moment, then added, quietly, "We'd also note that this filing is a matter of public record, and that any claim inconsistent with a sworn federal securities certification carries its own separate legal exposure for the party making it." I watched Holbrook's face when he read the exhibit copy Priyanka had also handed him, watched the specific, fast recalculation happen behind his eyes, the look of an attorney realizing his own clients had handed him a case built on a foundation they themselves had already signed away. He asked for a brief recess to confer with his clients. Judge Castellano granted 5 minutes, though it ended up being closer to 11 by the time everyone was back in their seats, which is where the version of this story people tell later gets its 11 minutes from, not some dramatic countdown, just an ordinary recess that happened to run a little long while a father and a brother sat in a hallway arguing, apparently, about whether either of them had actually read what they'd signed 6 years earlier. I found out, much later, secondhand from Boone, who'd overheard part of it standing near the water fountain outside the courtroom doors, that the argument in that hallway had gotten sharp enough that a bailiff had walked over to ask them to lower their voices. Denny, apparently, had turned on our father almost immediately, asking why he'd never mentioned signing anything as part of the 2017 raise, and my father, in turn, had insisted he barely remembered the document at all, that Holbrook's own paralegal had walked him through a stack of paperwork years ago, and he'd signed where he was told to sign, trusting, the way a lot of people trust professionals with legal documents, that someone else had already checked it for problems. It was, Boone said, less a strategy conference than two men realizing, in real time, in a public hallway, that they'd each individually signed the exact weapon now being used against them, without either one previously telling the other it existed. When they came back, Holbrook requested a case management conference rather than proceeding further that day, the polite legal version of a full retreat, and within 3 weeks, the complaint was formally withdrawn. I didn't celebrate. I want to be honest about that, the same way I've tried to be honest about the rest of this because it would be easy to end the story there at the withdrawal, as though a dismissed complaint fixes what actually broke. It doesn't. My father has not spoken to me since that hearing, 14 months now if you count from the filing, 5 months if you count from the day the case ended, and I don't know which of those numbers is the real measure of the distance between us. Denny called me once, about 6 weeks after the withdrawal, and the conversation lasted maybe 4 minutes, mostly him explaining, in a voice that sounded more exhausted than angry, that he'd signed that compliance document without reading it carefully because he'd trusted me, back then, in a way he apparently no longer did, and that discovering it had been the thing to end the lawsuit felt, to him, like one more piece of evidence that I'd always been better at this world than he was, even the parts of it that were supposed to be simple family favors. I told him I was sorry he felt that way. I didn't apologize for the document because I didn't do anything wrong by having it exist, and Priyanka had been very clear early on that conflating those two things, regret over the family pain and guilt over the actual legal facts, was a trap I needed to actively resist falling into. Denny hung up before I could say much else, and we haven't spoken since. I've replayed that 4-minute call more times than I'd like to admit, turning over the specific note in his voice when he said trusted me, trying to figure out whether there was a version of that conversation where I could have said something that actually reached him instead of just defending a position. I don't think there was, honestly, not in that moment, not with 14 months of litigation sitting between us. But I still think about it, usually late at night, usually after Theo's asleep and the house has gone quiet enough that the parts of my life I don't examine during business hours have room to surface. Doyle Precision closed for good 4 months after the case ended, a decision my father had apparently been circling for over a year regardless of the lawsuit's outcome, unable to keep the doors open against an industry that had moved past what the firm could offer. I only found out it had closed from my mother, who found out from a cousin because nobody in the direct chain of my father or brother thought to tell me, which felt, in its own quiet way, like its own kind of verdict on where I currently stand in that family. I drove past the old Round Rock office once, a few weeks after I found out, not planning to, just found myself on that stretch of road on the way back from a client meeting, and took the exit before I'd fully decided to. The sign was already gone, just the pale rectangle on the brick where it used to hang, and a "For Lease" sign propped in the front window. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes, the same lot where I'd learned to parallel park at 16 while my father coached me from the passenger seat, patient in a way he rarely was about anything else, and then I drove home without going inside, because there was nothing left inside to see, and because I wasn't sure I was welcome there even if there had been. The rest of my life kept moving through all of this, the way it apparently does for everyone who's lived through something like this, a fact I've come to find both comforting and slightly strange. Ledgerly closed a Series C funding round 2 months after the hearing, entirely unrelated in timing but impossible not to notice the coincidence of $22 million led by a growth fund that had been circling us for a year, and I spent the celebratory dinner with my leadership team that night distracted, unable to fully be present, thinking about an empty office in Round Rock 40 miles away that used to have my father's name on the door. My co-founder and head of engineering, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, who joined Ledgerly in year 2 and has been the actual technical backbone of the company for 4 years now, more than I've ever fully credited her for publicly, noticed I was somewhere else that night and didn't push, just quietly handled the toast I was supposed to give, which is the kind of thing you don't forget about a business partner. Priya has her own complicated family story, one she's shared with me only in fragments over the years. A father back in Chennai who still doesn't fully understand what she does for a living, despite her being, by any measure, wildly successful at it, and I think that shared, unspoken understanding between us about parents who struggle to see us clearly has made our working partnership stronger in ways neither of us has ever directly named. My wife, Elena, an emergency room physician who has her own entirely separate relationship with grief and crisis from a career that hands her both daily, sat with me on our back porch after that dinner and let me talk through the whole thing without offering advice, just company, which is mostly what I needed. Elena has never met my father more than a handful of times in the 9 years we've been together. He came to our wedding briefly, gave a toast that was more about Doyle Precision's 30th anniversary than about us, and left before the reception ended. And I think she spent most of our marriage watching me try to solve a relationship that was never fully solvable, offering the specific kind of patient support that doesn't try to fix what isn't fixable, just makes the unfixable thing easier to carry. Our son, Theo, turned 7 the month after the hearing, and I coached his Little League team that spring the way I have for 3 years running, and there's something I've come to value enormously about standing in a dusty infield on a Saturday morning, hitting grounders to a group of 7-year-olds who couldn't care less about SEC filings or family business or any of it, just wanting to know if they got the play right. Theo has started asking, this year, why he only has one living grandfather he actually sees, a question I've answered as honestly as a 7-year-old can absorb, which is to say not very fully, just enough to be true without being frightening. My sister-in-law on Elena's side, Camille, has become an unexpected source of steadiness through all of this, someone entirely outside the Doyle family fault lines who calls just to check in without an agenda, and I've realized, over the past year, how much I've come to lean on relationships that have nothing at all to do with my last name. I've also, somewhere in the last several months, started rock climbing again, a hobby I'd let go of almost entirely during Ledgerly's early grinding years, and I found something genuinely restorative about a Saturday morning at the climbing gym downtown, a physical problem with a clear, achievable solution, entirely unlike the sprawling, unresolvable problem sitting at the center of my actual family. My climbing partner, a guy named Oscar I met at the gym 2 years ago who has no idea what Ledgerly is and has never asked what I do for a living beyond a vague software, right? Has become one of the more reliably uncomplicated relationships in my life, precisely because it isn't attached to any of it. I think about my father sometimes, in his empty house now, 34 years of Doyle Precision folded up into storage boxes in a garage, and I think about the version of him that watched a 4-minute script run on his own office computer 9 years ago and told me, genuinely proud, that I had a gift. I don't know how to reconcile that man with the one who sat at a plaintiff's table in a new suit, laughing quietly with my brother, certain enough of his own version of events to put it in front of a judge. I've decided I don't have to reconcile them. Actually, I think they're both real, the proud father and the man who needed, desperately, for his own decline to be someone else's fault, and I think most people, if you watch them long enough under enough pressure, turn out to contain both of those men somewhere inside them. My mother tells me, gently, every time we talk that there's still time, that 71 isn't so old that a bridge like this can't eventually be rebuilt, and I want to believe her, the way you want to believe anyone telling you the thing you most need to hear. But I've also learned, over this past year, not to build my own piece around a timeline I don't control. Theo asked me recently, apropos of nothing, sitting in the back seat on the drive home from practice, whether Grandpa Walter was ever going to come to one of his games, and I told him I didn't know, which is the truest answer I have, and watched him accept it with the particular, uncomplicated resilience of a 7-year-old, already moving on to a question about whether we could stop for ice cream. And I found myself grateful, in that moment, for how much easier it is to be 7 than to be me. The document that saved my company is a public record now, filed permanently with the federal government, unambiguous, unchangeable, 6 years old, and utterly indifferent to what it cost the people who signed it. I keep a copy of it in a drawer in my office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of something I'm still working out the shape of, that the truest things about a family sometimes get written down accidentally, in the middle of paperwork nobody thought mattered at the time, and that by the time anyone reads them again, they've become the only version of the story nobody can argue with, even to people who wish, very badly, that they could.